One of the myths of 1926 is that unlike the hot-blooded Latins in Italy or France, the British working class were always very polite. They played football between strikers and policemen. It's true they did, actually, in Plymouth. Strikers won 2-1 for those interested. I always distrust people who cheer at that point, because the whole thing, of course, was a setup to lower the level of resistance. Anyway, but that's a myth. Why is it worth revisiting an event of 100 years ago? It is because we are facing a world on fire. Imperialist war, violence, the rise of fascism and racism, the endemic poverty, the potential of environmental collapse, the cost of living crisis, and so on. There's an immense fury in society about it. Look at the Palestine movement. But what's the social force that can break capitalism and imperialism? That's the argument. And when I joined the SWP in the mid-1970s, it was obvious that force was organised workers at the point of production. Strikes, big strikes. We'd just seen these huge strikes which had defeated a Tory government, which had broken the anti-union laws, which had shattered the Tory government's attempts to discipline the workers. That's not true now. Now the dominant view is the way you change the world is by direct action, by heroic individualism, by states fighting other states, like the Iranians fighting back against the Americans, or by armed struggle, Hamas, or even more narrow individual acts of knocking out leaders and so on. Now, there are many ways in which the working class people struggle, and they're all important. But I want to argue that the most effective form is strikes, and workers acting as workers using their collective power in the workplace. And the great thing about 1926 is it demonstrates the power of workers when they move. 1926 saw about 2 million workers come out on strike in Britain from 1 minute to midnight on the 3rd of May 1926, almost exactly 100 years ago. And for 9 days, they came out in solidarity with 1 million miners, just over 1 million miners, who had been locked out of their pits because they refused to accept longer hours and reduced pay. May come as a shock to some of the others. There were at the time over 1 million people who went underground and dug up coal. This is not an argument for fossil fuel capitalism, but it was an absolutely central thing. Coal was central. It's how you made gas. It's how you heated domestic homes. It's how you kept factories going. It's how you kept many ships going, and so on and so on. It was more important in some ways than oil is today. And this came at a long period of stormy class conflict. 15 years, I haven't got time to go into it, before the general strike saw repeated big strikes in Britain. Because things like the Russian Revolution, for example, of 1917, which encouraged workers to think that they could fight, or the First World War, which seen terrible slaughter and what their ruling classes could do. And this inspiration meant that when, in 1925, the government, in alliance with the coal bosses, said, we are going to cut the pay of miners and we're going to make you work longer, people fought back against it. People fought back against it. They did a 7-hour day in the pits, although actually it was often 8.5 hours. Because the 7 hours was from the last person down to the first person up. And if you weren't the last one down, the first one up, you worked much longer than that. And normally you walked for an hour or more to the pit in the morning to go to work. So with the 7-hour day, it was often 9.5, 10 hours in truth. 6 days a week, by the way. And then they said, we want you to work longer for less. And people fought back against it. And it came at the same time as other great class struggles. The struggle against the empire. Judy will talk more about this, but the struggle in Ireland, the Eastern Rebellion of 1916, and the civil war that followed, that broke off. That's why Ireland isn't all part of Britain now. Broken off because of the resistance. And the struggle of the suffragettes. Women fighting for the vote with tactics far more militant than anything that Palestine Action has ever done. Trying to poison people, attacking cabinet ministers, smashing windows, digging up golf courses, burning down buildings, and so on. A time of intense class struggle was going on. 1925, the miners were going to go on strike, and the government said, we're not ready. We're not ready. And therefore, they gave a subsidy to the coal owners and said, don't cut the wages at the moment. For 9 months, we'll make up the difference. But after 9 months, we'll come back again. The unions thought this was a great success, fantastic success. And it was, in truth, a victory. But everyone knew it was a struggle postponed that was going to come later. And we now come to the 3rd of May of 1926, and there the strike has begun. Immense enthusiasm for it, immense enthusiasm. In Hackney, for example, I can go on a long time about Hackney, so don't get me started. But in Hackney, to start the strike off, the day before the strike, they marched from just at the bottom of the Narrowway, down to Bethnal Green, the Salmon and Bull, which was the site of many political meetings, kept going, down to the bottom, turned right, past Whitechapel, down to Aldgate, then across to St Paul's, then Fleet Street, then the Strand, then Kingsway, then off to Oxford Street, to Marble Arch, to the other side of Hyde Park. I think it would take that 2.5 hours to march it. But they did it of immense enthusiasm about the strike. And there are 3 crucial things about the strike to remember. Number one, it showed massive class consciousness. People came out and supported one another. Even though they weren't directly affected as miners, they came out and supported them because they had broken from, let's remember, this is just 8 years from the end of the First World War. First World War, all about nationalism. We're all British against the horrible Germans. The 1926 was about class. It's about very clear class consciousness. The second thing is, it was quite violent. This is systematically removed from many of the histories because they don't want to accept that British workers can be quite violent when they're fighting back. There were big picket lines and they fought. In Hackney, for example, Kingsland Road, there was a mass battle between strikers and cops, which sort of, in the end, was a sort of uneasy compromise between them. And you know that bus depot at the bottom of the Narrowway? That was the tram depot. There were trams in Hackney in 1926 to take people directly from Hackney through to the docks, which is why Grove Road through Victoria Park is so straight, because it's the old tram tracks through it. And in that tram depot, they brought in, under military escort, army, they brought in students and so on, because students were all very rich types of people at the time. They brought students in to run the trams. A mistake. Strikers immediately surrounded the whole depot and held the place for 12 hours. Not a tram moved. And then the scabs, the blacklegs, the strike breakers said, we've got to get out because we haven't got any food. We've got to eat. And there was no military there to get them out. So they sort of climbed out of windows and ran away. They were then chased all the way down Mayor Street to a horse trough, which you can still see. A horse trough at the triangle at the bottom of Mayor Street, where they were all thrown in this horse trough. And no one attempted to scab there ever again. And Hackney was an incredible storm centre of the strike, run from a council of action, workers organising in Kenmure Road, just off the Narrowway. But, you know, I could... It's easy to luxuriate in these things, and I do luxuriate in them quite a lot because, you know, I won't go through it, or you can read it in the book. But again and again, mass pickets and groups of strikers, they fought the cops, they fought against strike breaking, and they didn't back off against the state. And the second really important thing is when people move into really big struggles, they don't just go on strike, they start to discuss how to run society. Partly because of necessity. If all the transport has stopped, and all the transport stopped, how do you get supplies? Food. to people? Who makes sure the hospital still continues? Who makes sure that the schools, if they can still get food and so on? You have to argue about these things. And in many places, trade union organisations, through these councils of action, which were originally set up to stop the British government attacking the Russian Revolution after 1917, these councils of action took over running their local areas. They weren't all the same. Some of them were quite conservative and so on. But even in the most conservative ones, they decided whether a lorry could go or not. They had to have a voucher on it, allowed by the Trades Council, that it moved. Nothing moved unless workers said it. And the highest level, like the example we give in the book is the Medal Council of Action in Fife in Scotland, they had everything. Communications subcommittee, food subcommittee, propaganda subcommittee, music and song subcommittee, and on and on and on of that sort. That's incredible. Brilliant, thank you very much. Very good example. The problem was, after 9 days, the trade union leaders who had never wanted to launch the strike decided it was time to stop. Why was it falling apart? It was not falling apart. Quite the reverse. Let's just quote what they said after the strike. This is Jimmy Thomas, who was a rail workers leader. What I dreaded about the strike more than anything else was this: if by any chance it should have got out the hands of those who would be able to exercise control, every sane man knows what would have happened. In other words, if people like you had become leaders of the strike locally, which of course in many areas they were, then it would be Charles Dukes, who was the leader of the General and Municipal Workers Union, now the GMB. Every day the strike proceeded, the control and authority was passing out the hands of responsible executives into the hands of men and women, actually, though he doesn't say it, who had no authority, no responsibility, and were wrecking the movement. They were taking it over from the trade union leaders and doing it themselves. And this is what they feared, that people were going to go beyond simply an industrial dispute and demand political transformation as part of it. Now, here's a poem. I'll get a bit longer because of a poem.
Okay, we've got about 2 minutes.
Yeah, that's fine. This is Idris Davis. We'll have a nice Idris Davis one later. This is Idris Davis writing, who was a great Welsh poet mentioned in the book. Here he is writing about the trade union leaders, and it's so bitter. The telephones are ringing and treachery's in the air. The sleek one, the expert at compromise, is bowing in Whitehall, and lackey to fox to parrot cries, "The nation must be saved." What is the nation? Who are the nation? The sleek one, the expert at compromise, is chattering in Whitehall. The robber, the gambler, and the parasite yell when the hour of reckoning comes. The sleek one, the expert at compromise, is signing in Whitehall. The buying and selling is over, the treachery sealed and called a national triumph. And this goes down to history, yellow and edged with black. And that was a strong feeling among strikers. I mean, one of the nice things about the book is that it showed, at the start of every chapter, is the telegrams that we found in the TUC archive that were sent to the TUC by people locally who said, "Why on earth have you called it off? We're really strong, and you've got nothing. You've got nothing." And they had got nothing. And they poured these in. And one of the extraordinary facts is there were more people on strike the day after it was called off than on the last day of the strike, because people kept coming out and saying, "We're continuing." And the miners had been given nothing. And the TUC, the trade union leaders, called off the general strike, and the miners fought on for 7 months. 7 months they fought on before eventually they were starved back to work. Starved back to work. Despite immense efforts. Hackney had a miners' choir, for example, that used to go around and do meetings for people to arrange money. So what you learn from it is the incredible militancy, potentially, of workers, how workers change in struggle. Julie will talk more about some aspects of that. And that the trade union leaders were an immense problem, and that you have to find grassroots way of connecting of militants, politically as well as economically. I'll talk about the politics of the Communist Party perhaps a little later, in order to be able to make the potential into actuality. One final point, which is when we were writing the book, it felt very, very difficult, this argument. I think it's got a bit easier. It's got a bit easier because of things like the Italian general strike over Palestine. It's real, it's possible. And although it's absolutely true, the trade union leaders will always sell you out. Don't start with that when you talk about 1926. You start with the potential of workers to change the world, the heroic nature of the women and men who were activists inside it, the capacity of people to bring to a halt all the normal ways in which society operates, and then to begin running it in a different way yourself. And that's the real inspiration we should take from it, and which we should continue to argue for.
You get this sense, right at the beginning of the 9 days of the strike, that women shocked the establishment with their militancy and their eagerness to be involved. So there were stories in the big confrontations in Elephant and Castle that women laid their babies in front of some of the scab buses to stop them, which is quite a brave act. More commonly, they lay down themselves in front of the buses, and when the young students were who were driving, the scab students who were driving the buses were dragged off, the commentators said they were lucky if they got to the men, because the men would just give them a black eye. If they got to the women, they'd get a really rough time, because women were fighting for their communities, for their right to work, and in solidarity with the miners. The biggest change occurred not in that short time, but in the months of the lockout of the miners, because it takes time to throw off ideas about what women's role in society should be, what the family should look like. But during the very difficult months of the lockout of the miners, you saw all kinds of changes. And so for me, the most important thing about researching the book and writing it and talking about it is two things. One is, ordinary people are capable of huge acts of solidarity with others. They went on strike not for their own jobs, but for the jobs of the miners. They knew that if the miners had gone down, they would too also go down, but it was an act of solidarity, and it played out across the colonies, the British colonies as well. And secondly, that collective struggle, ordinary people fighting where they work, over how they're paid, over their wages, changes their ideas, changes how they live, changes everything, and that new possibilities open up. And you can see this theme running throughout the book in the chapter on women, in the chapter on imperialism, and in the chapter on literature. Because if this had just been a timid, polite game of football between a few British bobbies and a few polite, subservient strikers, it would not have echoed through women's lives and through the literature of the period in the way that it did. Mm-hmm. And the context for particularly discussing women's lives is that the decade of the 1920s was one of great change. And some of you might be familiar with the idea of the flapper girl, you know, a kind of hedonistic response to the horrors of the First World War. Women over 30 got the vote in 1918 for the first time, and there was this sense that things were opening up for women. The first Mary Stopes family planning clinic opened up in London in 1925. The disposable sanitary towel was invented, which might not seem a great earth-shattering thing, but it actually meant women could go to work throughout the month without any fear and worry. But politically, the impact of this was a fear that women, having had the vote, might use it in radical and unexpected ways. There was fear of what they called the flapper vote, or the petticoat government. Now, this is a long way away from the mining communities. The mining communities were very conservative. Women tended to be stuck in the home. They had big families, often 10, 12 children, and they were responsible for all the housework and all the care. And a lot of care was required. In most mining communities, there was no running water, there was no electricity, there was extraordinary hardship and very high levels of disability. And all those people who had lung diseases, who were the victims of accidents down the mines, were cared for in the family. And it's one of the reasons that the miners would not allow an extra hour on their day, was because the last hour of the day was when the accidents happened, when you were tired, when you lost concentration, when you put your hand where it shouldn't be. So that hour wasn't just about taking away your leisure time, it was committing more and more miners to disability and potentially very serious accidents. Women's lives changed during the lockout. They transformed things that had been customs used to humiliate unruly women and used them against the scabs. One of these was white shirting. Women had been forced to wear a white shirt if they were considered to be unruly and naughty in any way. They turned this on scabs. They chased scabs through the streets, waving white shirts at them. They forced them into white shirts and wheelbarrows and dragged them through the streets to humiliate them. But also they organised. The Fed, the South Wales Mining Federation, and women organised huge collective efforts to feed something like 9,000 families a day were being fed collectively. And so women, for the first time in many of their lives, were not polishing their own front step, cooking their own food from scratch, looking after their own parlour, keeping things respectable. They were collectively providing for people in order to keep the strike going. And there was an element of joy in this. When you read the autobiographies of people, they remember this summer as a hot summer. It wasn't a hot summer. But for many of the miners, it was the first time, apart from being in the trenches, that they had been above ground. So to them, this spring was a beautiful spring. Despite the hardship, despite the difficulties, it was the summer of jazz concerts, of cultural experimentation, of midnight concerts in the streets, and it changed everybody's lives. There was a fear that summer amongst the ruling class that they were losing control of women, of miners, of the working class in this country, but also of the empire, because this great level of class struggle in Britain coincided with unruly strikers in the British Empire. Charlie mentioned Ireland, but the biggest headache, the greatest national liberation struggle at this point was in India. India had been promised self-government during the First World War. India had been promised reform. All those promises were torn up, and huge strike movements developed across India in the 1920s. These are things that are kind of forgotten now, but I'm just going to read you a quote. I find it extraordinarily powerful that Indian miners and Indian textile workers striking against their own bosses and the repression of the British Empire could nevertheless express solidarity with British miners. What an extraordinary sign of solidarity. In an article called Sympathy Strike by Indians, the Herald reported that some 250,000 miners in Bengal, 60,000 of whom were women, were organising to strike in sympathy with their brothers in Britain. 2 days later, there were plans by Indian miners to do collections, even though they earned so little, because for them it was the solidarity and the internationalism that was important. I mean, it's also true that in Hong Kong, 100,000 Hong Kongese workers were out on strike in 1925 and 6 against the British colonialists, and the British government used the same tactics as they did against the miners. They locked up communists, they rounded up the ringleaders, they recruited volunteers, and they tried to smash those strikes. And the British working class organised a hands-off China campaign to try and build solidarity between workers in Britain, workers around the world, and the workers striking in Hong Kong. In other words, they stood up to the racism, the colonialism, and the divisions that bought off and infected some aspects of the working class, because in struggle it made sense. So my very final point is to turn to a woman called Sarah Wesker, who was a young Jewish communist woman from East London. She pulled out some of her textile workers, even though they hadn't been called out to join the general strike. They walked out nevertheless. And after the horrific defeat of the strike, Sarah went on to organise more strikes of low-paid garment workers. And one of the ways they raised money was to sing strikes and strike songs, of which we'll hear more later. Now, this one says it's the tune of Nebraska, but the only song I know called Nebraska is by Bruce Springsteen, so I'm guessing it's not that tune. So I'm going to read it as a poem, one of the poems of the striking textile workers in Hackney, and it's called I'm Going Back. I'm going back to Polikoff's at Hackney, that's the garment factory, and if he should want to sack me, none of us will go back, no, not one. We will all go back together like a solid piece of leather. We will whack him till the strike is won. We'll picket the old germ and we'll picket his old firm until we make him squirm and he surrenders. And then we'll finish up with this strike. And inside the union we like, we'll stick united till the end. And that's the message of the strike.
I will be.